The Remedial Herstory Project is a nonprofit working to get women's history into the K-12 curriculum. To help us meet our goal, we produce media, lesson plans, and so much more. Check it out on our website, www.remedialherstory.com. The Remedial Herstory Project is funded through grants and by listeners like you. Please head over to patreon.com and become a supporter of the Remedial Herstory Project. You too can help us reform education and allow women to be seen, heard, and complicated. In particular, funds from patrons added from here on out will help us launch a crash course YouTube channel on women's history. We will be producing short 10-minute videos that educators can play in their classes telling women's history from era to era for both U.S. and world history. Let's make herstory together.
Hey, Kelsie.
Hey, Brooke.
Want to tell everyone what's happening in today's episode?
We are going to be talking about the one, the only, Maria Theresa.
Oh, I don't know her.
Really?
Yeah, no.
Oh, she is the grandmother of Europe.
Oh, the grandmère of Europe. Of
Oui.
all of Europe?
All of it.
Wow.
I don't know. I probably shouldn't have made that claim.
But pretty close.
Yeah.
From what we understand.
Sure.
Wide sweeping grandmother.
Sweeping.
Europe.
That's it.
Okay.
Continent.
Great.
Let's get into it.
Let's do it.
Hello, and welcome to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%, the podcast that explores what happened to the women in history class. Now, here's your host, Kelsie Brooke Eckert, and her partner in crime, Brooke Neva Sullivan.
In this episode, we are going to be asking the question, how did Maria Theresa use her influence and power to shape modern Europe?
Whoa.
Bam. This is an incredible woman that we have not heard enough about.
Yeah. I mean, you know me, I never know. But who is she? Tell me more.
Okay, she is the ruler of the Habsburg dominions from 1740 until 1780.
Can we just pause on that name? The Habsburg minions?
Yeah, so the Habsburg family is dominions.
Oh, sorry.
Not minions.
I was like, this is a great gang.
Yeah. The Habsburgs are this family that are in lots of royal families across different kingdoms of Europe. And she rules outright for 40 years. She's the sovereign of, these are the dominions that are within this empire: Austria, Hungary, Croatia, Bohemia, Transylvania, Mantua, Milan. I mean, the list goes on. It just, they rule a lot of Europe, right?
Yeah.
So she is by marriage Duchess of Lorraine, Duchess of Tuscany, and a Holy Roman Empress.
Jeez.
And so all this, keep in mind, is happening, to parallel U.S. history. This is during colonial times that she's ruling. And as the American Revolution is happening, is towards the end of her reign. So
and is she running solo? She doesn't have a king or a husband at this point?
She is a ruler outright.
Ruler outright.
Yes.
Amazing.
Yes. So what's really important about her in world history is her children. And Brooke, just peek over here.
Well over 16?
She has 16
biological
children. Okay.
She birthed those?
She birthed these
those
humans.
Walked out of a vagina?
Yes.
Oh my God.
I don't know if they walked. But
by the 16th they did.
Oh my gosh. But some of the children include people like Marie Antoinette.
Let them eat cake.
Yes. And what's important is that these children get married off, and some of them go on, King Leopold II, he's a Holy Roman Emperor.
How do you not rule Europe with a family that big? We're just gonna take it all. No, I have 16.
Yeah.
I have 2 basketball teams. Yeah, I can play the Olympics alone.
So she's pretty interesting in that she is in this position of power to rule outright a massive empire in the middle of Europe. And then she has so many children that she can marry them off and they can rule various places around Europe. So how does she use this power? How does she use this influence? And how does she shape Europe? These are kind of the enduring
How does she?
questions.
She's pregnant for most of it. Jeez.
So I'm really excited. Today on the podcast, we have Dr. Barbara Stollberg-Rilinger, and she recently wrote a book on this incredible woman. And so I'm going to let her introduce herself. This podcast is sponsored by our patrons. Patrons get access to behind the scenes, regular RHP gear, bonus episodes, insights into our research, lesson plans before everybody else, and more. Brooke, read off these awesome people.
Thank you to Jeff, Barbara, Christian, Kent, Jamie, Jenna, Nancy, Megan, Leah, Mark, Nicole, Anne, Sarah, Alicia, and Katya.
Woohoo! Do you know what is so awesome about this particular group of people?
No, what?
Very few of them are actually educators. These are badass people who care so much about equitable and inclusive education that they are willing to put their money where their mouth is.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so cool. You too can become a patron of the Remedial Herstory Project by heading over to www.patreon.com and becoming a sponsor of the Remedial Herstory Project for just $5 a month. That's it. That's one latte.
I mean, it's one of something, but it's cheap, and you get all that stuff.
All that stuff. You too can give up one latte for thousands of children and women.
You could also buy condoms for more than that.
You could reduce
reproduction for less than that.
Brooke, most importantly, instead of lamenting that women's history isn't being taught in high school or that they didn't know these women, these people are putting their money where their mouth is, and they are getting it into the curriculum by funding us.
It's awesome. And they believe women's stories are important.
Yes.
Thank you.
Duh. Thanks, patrons. We love you.
We do love you.
My name is Barbara Stollberg-Rilinger, and I'm a historian of the early modern period. History of Europe, especially political and cultural and social history. And I'm also the rector of the Berliner Wissenschaftskolleg, which is an institute for advanced study. And what directed my attention to Maria Theresa, the Empress, Queen and Empress Maria Theresa, was not so much the person herself, but rather the period when she lived. She lived from 1717 to 1780. So I wanted to take her life, her biography, as a key to the whole period. This is, my idea was that she as a person was very ambivalent. She had a very ambivalent relationship to her century. And the century itself was also very ambivalent, being on the one hand, still the century of Baroque or late Baroque, and on the other hand, the century of Enlightenment, of course. And she herself was on the one hand an enemy of Enlightenment. Yeah, she detested the enlightened contemporaries, but on the other hand, she didn't know that she herself was an enlightened person, and that her reforms later would be called enlightened absolutism.
I think that's so fascinating. We've noticed that these women have sort of interesting ascents to the throne. And how did Maria Theresa do that?
First of all, one must keep in mind that early modern monarchies were you inherited the rule by birthright. You didn't come to the throne by election, but by birth. And that means that also women, according to the respective rules of succession, could become queens of their own right, so to speak. So she inherited the throne from her father, Charles VI, because her father had changed the rules of succession of his provinces before, and so she was the legitimate Queen and Archduchess of Austria, Queen of Hungary, Queen of Bohemia, and so on. this was not a state in the modern sense, but it was a bundle of provinces, as usual in the early modern period, not a modern state. So she inherited all these titles and came to the throne in a legitimate way. But as her contemporaries used to think, were convinced that women in general are weaker than men in body, mind, and soul, female rule appeared to them less legitimate. So you always had a problem as a woman on the throne, as a regent or as a queen or whatever. And this was also the case with her. All of her enemies around her tried to partition her provinces among them. So they started a war, the War of Austrian Succession, immediately after her accession to the throne, which is very well known. Her most best known enemy, of course, was Frederick II of Prussia, Frederick the Great. But even more important were the Elector of Bavaria and the King of France. So these very powerful enemies tried to wage war against her for years, and she had to defend her reign against all of these enemies. And you must imagine, I mean, this is what made her a living legend, because she was a very young and in the eyes of the contemporaries, beautiful young woman, 23, only 23, a mother of two children already, and she ascended to the throne in a situation of complete mess and even in a catastrophic situation, and she managed to defend her provinces against these extremely powerful enemies over the years. I mean, it took 8 years. So this made her a legendary figure already for her contemporaries, and created her myth. Of course, there is a true core to this myth, because it is admirable how she managed to defend as a young woman without any experience to defend her provinces against so many enemies.
Well, I'm very intrigued about this myth. You've mentioned it a couple times, and now I need to know. So, can you talk a little bit about her role during the larger century? And you've talked a little bit about how influential she is. So a piece of that is clearly just securing her territory. But then she also reformed so much, despite not really being an enlightened fan. So I'm curious, what impact does she have on this period and the larger era?
Maybe first of all, I should say that I think that her role in this respect, as a reformer of her states, has been overrated over time. So historians of the 19th century used to say that she was the creator of the modern Austrian-Hungarian state, which is much too much to say. I mean, her bundle of territories was reformed, yes. Central power was strengthened under her reign. There was a series of reforms under various advisors. There were a couple of influential advisors to her whose reforms were very different. And I would say that the reforms by far did not reach what they really were meant to, but they just initiated a period of reforms, producing ever more bureaucracy, ever more paperwork, ever more. They needed ever more money, of course. It created ever more problems also, so that the reforms led to new reforms of the reforms and reforms of the reforms of the reforms. So it was a never-ending cycle of reforms that she initiated. And the success of all these reforms, as I would say, and also other researchers would agree, I think, was much less clear than historians of the 19th century would say.
Now, you mentioned before that she had 2 kids when she ascended the throne. She went on to have 16 kids. So how does she, I mean, she must have been pregnant through most of her whole time, right?
Yes, she was pregnant almost all the time when she was married. So 16 children, you can imagine what that means. I mean, for your health and so on. And she had an extremely strong bodily constitution. I mean, this is really admirable. And she was, I mean, when she was old, she was ill. She had several illnesses and so on, and she became very, very how do you say this in English? In German, you would say fat. She called herself obese. I mean, she called herself La Grosse Thérèse. I mean, the fat Teresa. She called herself with irony. I mean, and she suffered from the fact that she lost her beauty. And when she was a young woman, she was admired for her being so lovely. And so she suffered from the consequences of these 16 pregnancies.
Now, children must have been raised by governesses, right?
Yes, of course. I mean, yes, of course. And this is also part of her myth, I would say, or her legendary reputation, that historians of the 19th century tended to depict her as a kind of bourgeois housewife, who cared for her children and so on, which is, I mean, the children were extremely important for her because a dynasty needed heirs. And so producing heirs and as much kids as possible was, of course, extremely important. But she, of course, did not, for example, she did not breastfeed them. Of course not. But in the 19th century, there was a very nice legend showing her breastfeeding a beggar's baby, a beggar woman's baby, as the icon of the good mother of her lands, which is, of course, completely ridiculous because she didn't even breastfeed her own children, because this wasn't usual at that time. So she didn't raise her children herself. But for her image and for her influence as a ruler and for the fate of the dynasty of Habsburg, it was, of course, extremely important that she had as many children as possible. And although there were more daughters than sons, and that was an unfortunate relationship, you had to produce as many sons as possible. In the book, I tried not only to describe her pregnancies and her way of educating the children, have the children educated and so on, but the way this was usually done in the 18th century, and to describe how this was, what was the state of the art in midwifery, what was the state of the art in healthcare and so on. So always tried to embed her personal story in the general structures at the time.
Well, that sounds probably appropriate given, I think helping modern women understand that women have been doing work outside the home forever and helping them understand how they did it. I think that's the challenge of women historians. Her reign, you've been talking about her as kind of this ambivalent leader. And one of the questions I had is her reign, in some of the things I've read, was known for its intolerance. Yes. And I'm curious if you think that's a fair assessment, and why.
Yeah, this is absolutely true. And to understand why she was what we would today call intolerant is that, she was a member of the House of Habsburg, and the House of Habsburg was an extremely wealthy and powerful dynasty. They had fought the Ottomans. They had defended Europe against the Muslims, so to speak, and they were a very important power of the Counter-Reformation. They had defended the Catholic faith against the Protestant Reformation. So, and they were very successful in that. So Maria Theresa was convinced that her dynasty had a kind of, you could say, trade-off with God. Yeah? God had bestowed the dynasty with the reign, the reign over huge parts of Europe, and the dynasty, in return, had the obligation to defend the true Catholic faith against all of its enemies. And this was her religious conviction. And you have to take this really seriously. I mean, she really believed that. She was a very pious, very religious person. And so she was absolutely convinced that there was a godly mandate. And she had to fulfill this, and which was a burden for her. I mean, you can imagine, as a 23-year-old on the throne of such an important empire, that was an extreme burden for her. So she took this godly mandate very seriously. A consequence of this was that she was convinced that she had to fight Protestantism. So she even tried to find out if there were any Protestants in her provinces anymore. Yeah, and try to either urge them to conversion or expel them. And this was extremely brutal in the end. Many of these, I mean, she forced them to confess. First of all, she sent missionaries to cover the crypto Protestants. If there were Protestants, they didn't show up. Of course, they hid away and tried not to be discovered. But she sent missionaries there in certain parts of the Alps where she was convinced that there were certain Protestant nests, so to speak, and she investigated them and then forced them to convert. And if they weren't willing to convert, or if they converted by kind of lip service and afterwards continued to read Lutheran books, for example, or something, they would be sent to Transylvania on the Danube, so by force. And that was a terrible fate, because many of the Protestants died on their way to Transylvania. They couldn't make their living there. They had no land there. They had no way to subsist there. So there is a lot of research about that. And the Austrian colleagues found out that a very large percentage of these expelled Protestants starved or died on their way to Transylvania. So this was extremely brutal. And she didn't want to know what really happened in far away in Transylvania. Once her son Joseph traveled to Transylvania and came back and reported what he had seen, what happened there, and that this was not a good idea to send the Protestants there. And she didn't want to know that. She tried to ignore that. Protestant is the one thing. The other thing, the Jews. In 17, I mean, there were, of course, Jewish communities all over her provinces, especially in Prague, in Bohemia. Prague was the most important Jewish community of the time. Several 10,000s of Jews. In her, at a certain point in the War of Austrian Succession, the Jews were. There was a rumor that the Jews had helped the Prussians, and then she decided to expel all of the Jews from Bohemia, first from Prague and then from Bohemia. And that was in December 1744, and they had to leave the city and the country immediately, as she decreed. Immediately, that meant by the 1st of January. And it was very clear that they would not survive that. Many of them would die on their way out, and they didn't know where to go, and so on. And so all of her advisors from the nobility and so on, strongly advised her not to do that, to take back this decree, but she didn't. And interestingly, this was then postponed several times and so on, but in the end, the Jews had to leave the country. And years later, they were allowed to return. Had to pay a lot of money to be allowed to return. Interestingly, the Jews themselves, they tried everything. They mobilized all their several intermediaries and all of the European courts. Even the Pope intervened in favor of them, and many other princes and so on intervened in favor of the Jews, because the Jews were so important for the whole commerce in the Habsburg lands. But she expelled them anyway. And interestingly, the Jews themselves were absolutely convinced that this was not due to Maria Theresa, this expulsion, but they were convinced that some evil advisors were responsible for this. And this is very interesting and historians call this phenomenon naive monarchism, that the subjects, not only the Jews, but in general, the common subjects, tended to admire to admire their ruler, and did not want to know that their misery was due to the ruler herself. This is a very significant phenomenon of early modern monarchies in general.
That's fascinating. I mean, it speaks to the myth you've been talking about.
Yes,
and the fact that she could expel people and send them essentially to poverty or death. And yet they still were like, it couldn't possibly be her. Oh, my Lord.
Yeah. This is interesting. And I asked myself, and I tried to answer this question in the book, how this worked. I mean, how her charismatic reputation subsisted, although there was so much evidence that it was actually not true. Yeah. And that, for example, part of her legendary reputation was that she was accessible to anyone, even to the lowest of her subjects. And that was also absolutely not true. She was much stricter than even her father had been. So she decreed that subjects had to, if they wanted to accede to the throne or wanted to have an audience, had to run through a very, very complicated procedure in advance and so on. So she was much more strict than her father even had been. And anyway, her reputation was she is the mother of her subjects. She is a loving mother. She treats her subjects as even better than she treats her own kids, and so on. And the question is, how can you explain this? And I think it's a very complicated answer I tried to give in the book, but and I tried to quote various sources of persons who managed to get access to her. For example, an orphan, a little orphan from Tyrol who made his way through her provinces as a kind of court jester. And he managed to get there, and afterwards described this in his autobiography. And he praised her, of course, as a loving mother, because he made it to her. But he was the exception. And the same is true for other visitors who made it to her audience and who afterwards described this to the reading public, because, of course, they were so proud of this achievement and tried to tell the world about this achievement. And so there were these reports which fostered her famous reputation as a loving mother of her lands. And of course, those who did not make it to her throne and to the audience, to the solemn audience, would not write about it and would not talk about it. So this famous reputation was spread by several media, by written media, by journals, by books, by, of course, pictures, images, beautiful images of hers were spread all over the provinces and so on. So there was a whole industry of Verherrlichung in German, of spreading her mythical or legendary image.
Would you say like propaganda? Would that be the word?
You could call it propaganda, although propaganda in this period would refer to religion usually. So, but it was also, of course, a religious cult, you could say, because she was a godly sent and mandated ruler. So, and this is also a chapter in the book, which is, I think, very important. Rule at the time was based on religion completely, and she was, and so you can call it propaganda, yes.
I've heard her referred to as the grandmother of Europe, and we mentioned that she had all these children. You briefly mentioned one of her children was Marie Antoinette, and I'm just thinking about how much changes by the time her children are, her children get married off, and they are then in positions of power in places throughout Europe. And I'm just thinking about how much changes by the time her children are in power, but also the influence that this dynasty, my co-host, I was telling her about the Habsburgs, and she had never heard that word before. And I was like, oh, but they were everywhere, and everybody was related to the Habsburgs somehow. So I just think there's this big influence beyond her own lifetime. And I'm wondering, does that contribute to the myth a bit?
Yes, of course. I mean, this is, of course, part of her myth. All of her, especially her daughters, were married to, the French king, or then the Dauphin, but then later king, and as we all know, ended up under the guillotine. But other daughters became one of them became a queen of Naples. One son became a great great Duke of Tuscany, and so on. So Italian provinces were reigned by her children, and so on. But France is, of course, the most important. That was, of course, the most important marriage, and all the more remarkable because the Habsburgs on the one hand and France on the other were enemies for centuries, had been enemies for centuries. And now in the course of the 7 Years' War, they became allies. And to confirm this alliance, Marie Antoinette had to marry the French heir. I mean, her myth is, of course, based on the fact that she was the grandmother of Europe, the grandmother of this extremely influential dynasty. But I mean, as you said, her children experienced this huge transformation, this complete transformation of monarchical Europe and the revolution and so on. And it's also interesting to see how differently the various children behaved during this transformation, which they experienced, but Maria Theresa herself didn't, of course. I mean, what she could have or might have experienced is, of course, the American War of Independence, but she didn't even notice that. I mean, she said that during the 7 Years' War, which was kind of world war already, she noted that America is as far away as the moon. Mm. So America was absolutely beyond her consciousness, so to speak. She wasn't aware of these transformations, these huge influential transformations on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean.
Mm. Wow. That makes sense. I mean, and when I teach about, people getting on those ships and going over to America, that it would be like going to space, like it was dangerous and it was, So that makes sense. That's an interesting comparison. It's funny that I make that comparison too. She's controversial. she's important. She's intolerant. She's ambivalent. Why do you admire her? I mean, you spent a lot of time researching her. Why is she someone important to you?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that I admire her in the strict sense of the word, because my methodological principle in general is not to identify with my heroine, with the figure, and to keep her at arm's length, so to speak. Yeah, to not to try to write kind of introspective biography, because this is a very, very strange and unfamiliar period if you take it seriously. It is very, very far away. It is before the great transformations around 1800. So it is, for me, all the persons of that time are too strange to really be admired in a way. I don't hate them either. I mean, I try to have a distanced view on them. But on the other hand, of course, I must say that she was a remarkable ruler in many respects, and that the contemporaries were right in a way to find her remarkable already. For example, what makes her remarkable is her extraordinary sense of responsibility for her lands, her remarkable sense of duty, her religious piety, the contemporaries, and especially historians in the 19th century, were impressed by her because they said she was the one great exception from the rule being women are weak. Women are not meant to rule. So she was the one exception that proved the rule. The exception that proved the rule. So, for example, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, the great Austrian writer, describes her as the great exception to the rule. And this is interesting because actually women did act as rulers in the early modern period very often, not only in England, but also in other countries. So she definitely was not that great exception. Afterwards, after the French Revolution, when in republics, when the monarchy was abolished and rule was transferred by elections, that was the moment when women had no say anymore. But before that, in the early modern period, women were meant to rule, or in many cases at least. So the French Revolution was not that progress in gender respects regarding gender relations. That was not at all the progress, the progressive change. By the way,
I had never thought of it like that, but that's so true, because when you take away the monarchy where women have ways that they can get to the throne, and you turn it over to an electorate, a male electorate.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. And they would not be elected. This is also true, for example, in her case, she inherited the rule over Bohemia, Hungary, Austria, and so on. But she could not become Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which is a very monstrous and unknown political entity. But for that, she had her husband. I mean, her husband was elected Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, because the Holy Roman Empire was, the Emperor was elected, would be elected, and not get the throne by inheritance. So she wasn't able to become Emperor. She was Empress because she was the Emperor's spouse. And this is why she wanted to become crowned Empress, because this would be a secondary status. She was crowned in huge ritual acts, King of Bohemia and King of Hungary, not Queen, King. So this was a male role. And it's very significant that she could not become emperor because that was by election, and she could not be elected as a woman. So this is just to show the connection between inheritance and female rule versus election and exclusively male rule. Yeah,
you're blowing my mind. So this is great. I'm curious. Talking about gender, do you feel like the monarchy did anything to help women at the bottom? Like, what, we talked earlier about her intolerance of Jews and Protestants. Like, were there any initiatives to support, other masses, and I guess specifically women, but, were there any things that she did to support people that religiously were in line?
Actually, to be serious, she didn't. Yeah. You can see this in the correspondences with her daughters, where she, on the one hand, wanted them to influence their husbands at the various courts in Versailles, in Paris, in Naples, and so on. But on the other hand, she was not at all a feminist avant la lettre. She wasn't at all. She told them again and again, especially Marie Antoinette, they should subordinate themselves to their husbands. They should not show that they were more smart or more bright than their husbands. They should never show this. They should always behave in a subordinate way. And so this was, of course, the opposite to a feminist attitude. She herself, as she was the heir to the throne, she was the ruler. She, of course, had no subordinate position, but her daughters had as spouses of kings. But they had to behave as subordinates. So she wasn't a feminist at all.
That's fascinating.
And this is also true, of course, for the common subjects, of course.
It seems to be a common pattern in women's history where women who are really like strong leaders and really powerful tell other women not to do what they're doing. It's like, what?
This is changing. I mean, this has changed, I would say, now.
Yeah.
But you always find these cases, yes.
Yeah, I hope it's changing. Just to help me wrap my mind around Austrian history a little bit, it's because it's foreign. Austrian history, in my mind, comes back in at World War I with, the death of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Are those people descendants of her? Like, are they Habsburgs? Or
yes, of course. Of course. Yes, of course, they are. Yeah, the Emperor Franz Joseph, Francis Joseph, of course, and all of the whole Habsburg dynasty, of course. And the interesting thing is that as the Habsburg dynasty lost one province after the other during the 19th century, not only with the First World War, but before, of course.
Yeah, with their wars with Germany, right?
They lost all partly, one after the other, lost all their provinces or their influence and so on. And interestingly, in parallel to this vanishing power in Europe, the legend of Maria Theresa was increased. So I think there is a correspondence. The more they lost influence, and they lost their former power, the more they needed this legendary figure as a figure of monumental history, in the sense of Friedrich Nietzsche, who said monumental history is a way to overcome despair and to strengthen the belief that former greatness can be restored in the future. So they needed this monumental figure of Maria Theresa in a century where the power of the Habsburg dynasty declined.
Wow. I mean, that just speaks to, I have always wanted to go to Austria and Germany. Now I need to get there.
Yes, you should. Yeah. So and I mean, it's important to see that what is Austria today was then only one part of this huge bundle of provinces. Huh? I mean, that was her oldest and most important, not the most important title, but she had the title of Archduchess of Austria. But this was just a small part of the huge bundle of territories, which, of course, Belgium, Italy, and so on. So Austria today is a very tiny, I must say, as a German citizen, it is the case that Austria is a very tiny country now. And for them, of course, still today, Maria Theresa is a very important figure of national greatness, of course.
Yeah. So your book is coming out?
Yes, I hope so.
Where can folks find your book if they're interested in finding it?
Princeton University Press.
Okay.
Yeah, it will be published by Princeton University Press in by January. I don't know exactly when. It took a long time to translate it, and as far as I can say, the translator did a great job. He's marvelous. He even tried to. There are certain poems which I quote in the text, and he even tried to mimic the style of the poems with the rhymes and so on. So he did a wonderful job, and it took a long time to proofread and everything. So finally, I very much hope that by January it will come out.
Oh my!
Princeton University Press. More than 1,000 pages, I must say, as a warning.
Well, a 45-minute episode is not nearly enough to cover the legacy of this woman, so they'll need to read the whole book.
You can also read several chapters and drop the others. I mean, you can drop the war chapters and just read the sex chapters, for example. So there are more or less interesting parts.
Oh, well, I'm sure it's all interesting. You're too humble. Well, thank you so much for meeting with me, Barbara. I really appreciate your time, and I'm so grateful for you re-educating me and helping me become a better historian myself. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much for listening to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts to bring more voices to the conversation. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time.